guys, it's Amanda, the Rhinestone Realtor, and welcome to my video. So I wanted to talk to you guys today about who all is involved in the real estate transaction. Did you know that in order to sell a property, there are 31 transactions made to make that happen? It's not just the buyer and the seller and their prospective realtors. There are so many other people behind the scenes working to make this happen. So we're gonna go through with my handy dandy notebook because even after 8 years of doing this, I don't want to forget anybody. So let's get started. First, the obvious are the buyer and the seller. Obviously, the seller's the one who owns the property, buyer's the one who's buying the property. Pretty simple, right? Well, the seller is going to hire a listing agent. So that is a person that you'll see the sign in the front yard that's usually got their face and their contact info on there. And that's typically who the buyer's agent is going to communicate with. So it's the listing agent's job to get the house ready, to put on the market, communicate with everybody throughout the transaction, and get that property sold. But did you know that the listing agent also has their broker involved too? So the seller doesn't have just the agent working for them, they also have the broker. So that is already 2 people working for the seller. There's also people who work for the listing agent. So I shouldn't say work for, work with. For example, when I list a property, I'm gonna hire about 3 or 4 different people when we get started. The first person is gonna be the professional photographer. We don't want those cell phone pictures that have the cats crawling on the countertop and the terrible lighting and whatnot. We want nice, bright, airy, professional, fantastic looking pictures. So that's why I bring in the professional, because my cell phone is not professional. I don't have that talent. I'll also bring in a videographer. So what he'll do is he'll come through the property and he'll have his little video and he'll get the coolest shots that I never thought of. For example, I was talking to him at one of my listings one time, and he had his camera on like this weird tripod that kind of like slid side to side, and he turned on the gas stove and was like filming the flame. I had no idea why he was doing it. It looked so cool in the video. So that's why you hire the professionals in their field. Whenever I put up a new listing, I'm also going to hire somebody to install the sign for me. So I'll use those big colonial posts where it's those 6-foot tall white posts to put the signs out in the front yard. Looks a little bit nicer and makes a little bit more of an impact. Plus, I don't have to worry about driving to and from the property to put it up, digging a hole in the ground when it's super hot outside and it hasn't rained in months, doing that in a dress and heels and trying to get a sign in there. It's not pretty, I've tried. So, hire the professional at that one too. There also is a transaction coordinator. So I'm sure you've noticed if you've bought and sold a house, probably in the last, I'd say the last 5 years, they've really gotten more popular and more apparent, where either an agent or a team will use a transaction coordinator. It's basically their assistant who will go through and make sure that all the paperwork is done correctly. Everybody gets a copy of the paperwork and that all things that need to be scheduled are scheduled out properly. So that's kind of the agent's right-hand man. That way the agent is out and about meeting people and showing property. Transaction coordinator is doing all the paperwork behind the scenes. So that is someone that can be on both the listing or buyer side, but it's usually not the same agent. There is also a compliance officer. So when we are doing a real estate transaction, guys, I can't talk today. When we're doing a transaction, we obviously have to do paperwork. These are legally binding contracts, so we do have somebody reviewing all the contracts to make sure everything's in compliance, everything is signed correctly, initialed correctly, and all parties have seen and received a copy of it. Now there's also usually going to be a lender involved unless someone's paying cash for a property. So there's going to be the loan officer. That's usually the main point of contact between the agents, the buyer, and the title company. That's the person who's going to collect all the information and make sure all of the documentation goes through the lending process so that the loan can be approved. There's also the processor, who's the person who goes through with a fine-tooth comb and makes sure everything is done correctly. And then there's also going to be an appraiser. So I'm sure everybody knows what an appraisal is. If you don't, that is a third-party person who is not party to the transaction. They're hired from the outside, and they come in, they take pictures of the property, they measure it, and they give the house a value based on other houses that have sold in the area. So that way there's no confusion over the price of the property, and it helps out with the loan as well. Then the next person is the escrow closing officer. So whenever you put a house under contract, it's called going under escrow. Means a title company is going to go through, make sure that whoever is selling the property is the only person who owns the property and the only one who has claims to it. They're going to do all of the paperwork so that they make sure that ownership of the property transfers from the seller to the buyer with no issues. There's also an escrow assistant or a processor. So usually it's a pair of two ladies, and they'll tag team everything together, and one lady will collect all the information, the other one will work on getting everything scheduled and do the actual closings when you're at the table signing closing documents. Now, behind the scenes, there is also a real estate attorney. Now, this is not a real estate attorney that represents buyer, seller, or anybody else in the transaction. They are hired by the title company to fill out all the paperwork and make sure that all of the documents are created properly. There's also insurance agents. I'm sure if you've ever owned a home or a car or a pet, you know what insurance is. So you are going to get insurance on the property for homeowners insurance. You want to make sure that in case something happens, that that loss is covered. There's also going to be an inspector that comes in. It is hired by the buyer to go into the property and see the condition, see if anything needs to be fixed out, and if there's any issues with health and safety concerns with the property. For example, is the roof leaking? Is the AC functioning? There's so many things that come up on inspections. It's crazy, but they're basically going to make sure that the property is healthy, safe, and functional. And then sometimes when you hire an inspector, you're going to call out a pest control or termite inspector. So they're going to come out and do, it's called a WDI, wood destroying insect inspection, and see if there are any termites currently or previously at the property. And then the next thing is going to be a notary. So we're going to have somebody go through and confirm that both the buyer and seller are who they say they are and that they did sign the paperwork and nobody else signed for them. So usually the escrow officer is also a notary and does that at closing at the same time. And then lastly, and probably most excitingly, are the movers. So most people will hire a moving company to come in and move their stuff from one property to the next, because that can be really exhausting after the whole purchase process and doing the closing. That takes usually about an hour, so sometimes you need to hire in that extra help. But yeah, if y'all have any other questions on who's involved in a real estate transaction, that's usually the top 20 that are involved. There are some additional ones, but that could be an hour-long video. So if you're concerned about who all is involved, feel free to comment down below or reach out and we will get things started. Have a good one.